You never know when your darkest hour might turn into your greatest turning point. The words lingered in the air, an eerie prophecy of what was to come. The storm raged with such ferocity that it seemed as though the world was about to be torn asunder. Trees bent and swayed violently in the wind. The dark sky cracked open with fierce flashes of lightning, and thunder boomed like an angry god's roar. The once peaceful desert wilderness near Flagstaff, Arizona, now seemed like a place straight out of a nightmare. Through the deluge, a piercing cry cut through the chaotic sound of rain and thunder. It was a desperate, heart-wrenching sound that seemed to emanate from the depths of the storm itself. A dog's cry, full of agony and fear, echoing through the night. For a moment it seemed like the storm itself had been torn apart by the anguish in that cry. Marcus Cole, a man whose life had been stripped of its former glory, sat alone in his cabin in the woods, listening to the storm rage outside. The cabin, tucked away in isolation, was his refuge, his fortress of solitude. It had been months since he'd seen another soul, months since he'd spoken a word to anyone. The memories of the war, of his lost legs, of the wife he'd lost to a stroke, all swirled around him like a never-ending storm of their own. Each day felt like a struggle to breathe, a battle to exist. Marcus had been a Marine sniper, one of the best. He had once stood tall, a soldier of purpose and valor, but that life was gone now, taken by an IEDA in Afghanistan that stole his legs and his sense of belonging. After the loss of his wife, his world had shrunk to nothing. The cabin, the storm, and the relentless silence were all he had left. But then, there was that cry. It came again, louder this time, a pleading wail that sliced through the walls of his isolation. It was close. Too close. The dog's desperate cries sparked something deep inside Marcus, a spark that had been smothered under years of anger, guilt, and loss. It was the call of something that needed help, something broken in the same way he was. He could have ignored it. He could have shut his blinds and gone back to the numbness of his existence. But he didn't. The storm, the cries, the overwhelming sense that something or someone was suffering out there. He couldn't let it go. Marcus pulled his worn jacket on and wheeled himself to the door. The rain lashed against his face as he maneuvered his chair through the mud and toward the source of the sound. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with a rare, unfamiliar sense of urgency. What was it about the storm, about this creature's pain, that stirred something within him? The trail ahead of him was slick and treacherous. The path was already dark, but now the heavy rain obscured everything further. Marcus, for all his military training, had never felt more vulnerable. His wheelchair was heavy, difficult to move through the sodden earth, but his resolve was stronger than the storm. Each turn of the wheel was a battle against his body, against the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he pushed on. Finally he saw it. In the distance, through the torrent of rain and sheets of water that blurred his vision, he spotted something. A shape. A movement. The dog. It was chained to a rusted post, its large frame shaking violently. Mud caked its fur, and it was shivering uncontrollably, its body an image of absolute defeat. The sight hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. His instincts kicked in, memories of the battlefield flooding his mind. He was a Marine. He had been trained to fight, to survive, to make split-second decisions. And now, here he was, facing a creature as broken as he was. A creature that needed him. He wheeled himself closer, each push through the muddy path, harder than the last. The dog whined as he approached, its eyes wide with fear, a mix of desperation and exhaustion in them. As Marcus neared, he could see the full extent of its suffering. The dog's ribs were clearly visible beneath its fur, and its eyes were sunken, devoid of hope. Without thinking, Marcus reached into his bag for his bolt cutters. His hands shook as he struggled to steady himself, the tool slipping in his grip, but he finally managed to cut the rusted chain that bound the dog to the post. As soon as the chain fell away, the dog collapsed into his lap, its frail body trembling with exhaustion. For a long moment, neither moved. The storm roared around them, But all Marcus could hear was the sound of the dog's shallow breaths. It had been through hell, just like him. Marcus didn't know why he did it. Perhaps it was the call of the storm, or perhaps it was the simple, undeniable truth that no one, man or beast, should be left to suffer alone. But as he cradled the dog in his arms, he realized that something had shifted in him. The weight of his isolation had lessened, even if just a little. The journey back to the cabin was slow. The rain hadn't stopped, and the path was still treacherous. But Marcus didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was helping, and maybe, just maybe, he was starting to heal. Marcus Cole had once been a man defined by purpose, driven by a mission that gave him direction and meaning. But now, as he sat alone in his cabin, the stillness of the woods seemed to consume him. He had once worn his uniform with pride, but now it was as if the man who had worn it had been lost to time. The weight of his past pressed on him like a never-ending storm, and there was no escape from the memories that haunted him. He had been a Marine sniper, a soldier with a reputation for precision and efficiency. Oh, the military had been his life, his family, and his identity. He had enlisted straight out of high school, eager to serve his country, to be part of something bigger than himself. But in the harsh terrain of Afghanistan, the world had shifted beneath his feet, and the very things he had once believed in had been shattered. The IED that had claimed his legs had also claimed the man he used to be. The explosion had torn through his body with a violence that left him barely alive. His legs had been lost instantly, and his body had been broken in ways that would never fully heal. But it wasn't just his body that had been destroyed, it was his soul. The war had changed him in ways that words couldn't capture, and the scars he carried were deeper than anyone could see. The nightmares, the flashbacks, the constant fear of losing control, they were his constant companions. But it wasn't just the war that had taken Marcus from the man he used to be. It was the sudden death of his wife, Elizabeth. The stroke had come without warning, taking her from him in an instant. 1 minute, they had been sitting together, making plans for the future. And the next, she was gone. Her death had been the final blow to his already fragile existence. It was as if the universe had decided that Marcus had already lost too much to ever find happiness again. After her passing, Marcus withdrew from the world. The world outside his cabin in the woods seemed too bright, too loud, too full of life. It was a life he no longer wanted to be a part of. He had no family, no friends, and no desire to make any new connections. His days were spent in isolation, locked away in a small world of his own making. The cabin, with its creaky floorboards and drafty windows, had become his fortress of solitude, a place where he could hide from the memories that never stopped haunting him. He spent his days going through the motions, never truly feeling anything. He would wake up in the morning, make a pot of coffee, and then retreat into the woods, rolling his wheelchair along the familiar trails. The peaceful isolation of nature was the only thing that brought him any peace. But even that was fleeting. The woods, which had once been a place of comfort, now felt like another reminder of everything he had lost. But then, there had been the dog. Marcus had always been a dog lover. His father had raised German shepherds when he was growing up, and some of his happiest memories were of playing with those dogs in the yard. He had always admired their strength, loyalty, and intelligence, but he had never imagined that a dog would become his lifeline, the one thing that could pull him back from the brink of despair. When Marcus found the dog chained to that post in the middle of a storm, something inside him stirred. He hadn't planned on rescuing the dog. He hadn't planned on doing anything. But the sight of the animal, broken and abandoned, had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. It reminded him of himself, once strong, once full of purpose, now reduced to something barely holding on. The dog, like him, had been abandoned, left to suffer alone. And Marcus, for the first time in months, felt the stirring of something deep inside him, a need to help, a need to do something that mattered. As he wheeled himself back to his cabin, the dog in his lap, Marcus couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to the animal. There was something in the way the dog clung to him, its frail body trembling with exhaustion, that reminded him of the bond he had once shared with his fellow Marines. Back in the war, camaraderie had been everything. They had fought together, bled together, and survived together. But now, all of that was gone. And yet, here was this dog, alone, broken, and in need of someone to care for it. Marcus had never considered himself a hero. He had always been the one who stayed in the background, the one who did his job and kept his distance. But in that moment, as he cradled the dog in his arms, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to help. Maybe, just maybe, he could start healing, not just for himself, but for this animal too. That night, after the storm had passed and the rain had finally stopped, Marcus sat on his porch with the dog by his side. He hadn't named the dog yet, but it didn't matter. The animal didn't need a name. It needed care, and it needed someone to love it. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he might be able to do just that. In the silence of the night, with only the chirping of crickets and the rustling of the wind in the trees, Marcus found a rare moment of peace. He wasn't sure where this journey would lead, or if he was ready for it. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope, and that was enough. He looked down at the dog, its head resting on his lap, and whispered, "You're safe now. You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in years, Marcus believed it. Marcus didn't think much about routine anymore. Life, in the wake of so much loss, had become a blur of days that folded into one another like a long, dark tunnel. The past was a shadow that clung to him, and the future seemed like an endless void. Yet, in this quiet, isolated life he had carved for himself, there was one thing he still did without fail every day: his walk through the woods. It wasn't much of a walk, really, more like a slow, contemplative roll through the winding trails around his cabin. With his wheelchair's large wheels gripping the uneven ground, Marcus could navigate the rough terrain just enough to feel the whisper of nature around him, to escape the walls of the cabin and, if only for a brief moment, be part of the world again. The walks had once been an exercise in escape, a way for him to distance himself from the pain and memories of his service and the life he had left behind. That morning, as Marcus rolled out of the cabin and into the thick Arizona air, the sky was already darkening, heavy clouds hovering over the peaks of the distant mountains. It was the kind of day that promised a storm. The air thick with anticipation, the smell of rain on the horizon. As much as Marcus preferred the sun to keep its distance from his life, he had learned to recognize the signs of a storm brewing. The air felt charged, as though the land itself was holding its breath. He didn't mind the rain. In fact, he often found solace in it. The soft patter of raindrops against his skin, the steady rhythm of water running through the dirt, it was all a kind of white noise, something to drown out the relentless noise of his thoughts. The storm had become an old friend to him in these years of solitude. It was predictable, constant, and indifferent to his suffering. But today, the storm seemed different. As Marcus made his way down the trail, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, and with them, the familiar, oppressive silence that had always accompanied his walks grew louder. There was no sound of animals rustling in the trees, no birds overhead, nothing but the rain and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. And then, through the sheet of rain, he heard it. It was a soft sound at first, barely a whimper, as though the wind itself had whispered a plea for help. Marcus paused, his hand on the wheel of his chair, his body tensing involuntarily. The whimper came again, louder this time, rising above the steady hum of the storm. It was unmistakable. A dog's cry. full of desperation. Marcus didn't hesitate. His heart rate quickened, his pulse drumming in his ears. The dog's cry pierced through the storm, and he was already moving. The wheels of his chair grinding against the wet dirt, pushing him toward the sound. The closer he got, the more he realized how isolated the place was. His cabin was nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest neighbor, and yet this cry, this haunting call for help, had managed to cut through the storm. As he rounded a bend in the trail, the source of the sound came into view. There, amidst the downpour, he saw it. The dog was large, a German shepherd, and it was chained to a rusted post by the side of an old wooden shed. The animal's fur was matted with dirt and soaked to the bone, its body trembling with cold and fear. It looked up at him with eyes wide and full of pain, eyes that seemed to call out to him, desperate for relief, for rescue. For a moment, Marcus was frozen. He was no stranger to pain, to suffering, but this was different. This wasn't a soldier in battle. This wasn't a comrade he had to leave behind. This was a living, breathing animal, one that had been abandoned to face the storm alone. It was as if the universe was showing him a mirror, forcing him to face the stark reality of his own solitude, his own abandonment. Without thinking, Marcus wheeled closer to the dog, his hands trembling as he reached into his bag for the bolt cutters. His fingers were numb from the cold, the rain seeping into his clothes, but the urgency he felt overrode everything else. He had to help. As his hand closed around the cutters, he noticed the dog wasn't moving much. Its body lay slumped, barely conscious, as if it had given up hope of ever being saved. It was too weak to even look up at him. But when the bolt cutters bit into the chain, the dog lifted its head weakly, letting out a soft, desperate whine. Marcus cut through the chain with one determined snip. The rusted links fell to the ground, and the dog, exhausted, barely able to stand, stumbled toward him. The rain continued to pour as the dog collapsed into his lap, its body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Marcus sat there in the mud, his wheelchair half submerged in the wet earth, with the dog lying across his legs. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain and the dog's shallow breaths. The storm roared overhead, but in that small pocket of the world, there was only them. Two broken beings, brought together by fate, by circumstance, and by a shared sense of suffering. Marcus gently ran his hand over the dog's soaked fur, his fingers tracing the sharp contours of its ribs. The animal had clearly been starved, abandoned for what seemed like days, maybe longer. It was as though the dog had been left to die, left to succumb to the storm's fury. But the storm wasn't the only thing that had brought them here. It was the quiet, the stillness, the desperate cry in the night, the same cry that had stirred something deep inside Marcus, a forgotten part of himself, a part that still cared. Perhaps in some small way, they had both been waiting for this moment, for this storm, for this dog. With a deep breath, Marcus carefully lifted the dog into his lap, holding it as he wheeled himself back to the cabin. The rain kept falling, the world around them soaked and dark, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something other than despair. Maybe he couldn't change the world, but for now, he could change the world for this dog. And in doing so, perhaps he was changing his own world too. The storm raged on as Marcus wheeled his chair back toward the safety of his cabin. The German shepherd nestled across his lap. The weight of the animal, though slight, seemed to anchor him to a reality he hadn't truly been part of for years. In that moment, Marcus felt the rain as something more than just water. It felt like a cleansing, like the beginning of something that had been long buried beneath the weight of grief and isolation. The cabin came into view, nestled against the edge of the dense forest, a small, weathered structure that had served as Marcus's refuge for months, maybe even years. The once proud military man, who had been trained to face danger, head-on, now found himself struggling with the simplest tasks. His legs bound to a wheelchair, his world shrinking to the confines of this remote location. But as he reached the threshold of the cabin, the weight of the German shepherd in his lap felt strangely comforting. Maybe it was the fact that he wasn't alone anymore, Or perhaps the dog represented something he had lost. A connection, a bond. When he finally made it inside, Marcus wheeled himself into the warmth of the small, dimly lit cabin. The space was sparse, nothing more than the essentials: an old couch, a small kitchen with a few cans of food, and shelves filled with military memorabilia. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He carefully set the dog down on the rug by the fireplace, gently stroking its fur as he tried to assess its condition. The dog's breathing was shallow, its body shaking from the cold, the exhaustion of the storm still clinging to it like a second skin. Marcus knew he had to act quickly. He grabbed an old blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over the dog, doing his best to warm it up. The German Shepherd, despite its trauma, didn't resist. It simply lay there, its head resting on the cold floor, being too tired to care. Marcus's heart ached as he looked at the animal. He wasn't sure what had happened to it, but it was clear the dog had been through hell. It had been abandoned, left to suffer in the storm, perhaps for days. And yet, now it was here, safe in his cabin, alive for the moment, but fragile, like a life that had been on the brink of disappearing. He took a deep breath and began to clean the dog's wounds. He had learned basic first aid in the military, and he knew that the dog's injuries weren't just physical. There was something deeper, something in its eyes that spoke of an emotional pain that ran deeper than any physical wound could ever go. The way the dog flinched at every touch, the way it cowered when he moved too quickly, told him everything he needed to know. This was a dog that had been abused, that had been broken by someone's cruelty. As Marcus worked, he couldn't help but feel a sense of camaraderie with the animal. He had spent so much of his life running from his own demons, his PTSD, his grief, his anger, and yet here was this dog, fighting to survive in a world that had cast it aside, just as he had been cast aside by the people who were supposed to care for him. The parallel, was unmistakable. After an hour or so of cleaning the dog's wounds and feeding it small amounts of water, Marcus finally leaned back in his chair, exhausted. The rain had stopped, but the night was still dark and quiet. The German Shepherd was resting now, breathing more steadily, but still looking up at him with those wide, haunted eyes. "You're going to be okay," Marcus whispered softly, more to himself than to the dog. He wasn't sure if he even believed the words, but they felt important. The dog needed to hear them, just as much as he did. Marcus knew that the next few days would be critical for the dog. He needed time to recover, both physically and emotionally, and Marcus had never been one for half measures. If he was going to help this dog, he had to commit fully. He had to give this dog everything he could, just as he wished someone had done for him. He had to heal the dog, even if he wasn't sure how to heal himself. Over the next few days, Marcus devoted himself entirely to the dog's recovery. He named the animal Tank, not because it was a particularly tough name, but because of the strength he saw hidden within the dog. The dog was battered, bruised, and broken, but Marcus could sense that there was more to Tank than the pain he had suffered. Tank had a will to live, a will to fight, and that was something Marcus could relate to. Tank's progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. He began to eat again, albeit cautiously, and he started to follow Marcus around the cabin, his movements tentative, as though he wasn't sure what to expect. He would flinch at sudden movements, and sometimes, when Marcus would try to pet him, he would shrink back, his body tense with fear. But there were moments, small moments, when Tank would let his guard down. When Marcus would sit down on the couch, Tank would lay at his feet as if seeking solace in his presence. It was in these moments that Marcus began to realize something. The bond between them was growing, slowly but surely. He wasn't just taking care of a broken dog. He was healing too. Tank, in his own way, was helping Marcus just as much as Marcus was helping him. It wasn't much at first. A smile that felt almost foreign to him, a laugh that came when he saw Tank doing something silly. But it was enough. Marcus had forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to have someone rely on him. But here, in the quiet of the cabin, with only Tank for company, he was learning again. He was learning what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. He was learning to love in the way that only an animal can teach a person. The cabin, once a place of sorrow and isolation, was beginning to feel like home again. Not because Marcus had returned to the life he had once known, but because he was starting to feel alive again. Starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. The days following the storm felt like a blur to Marcus. Time seemed to stretch and contract, marked only by the soft rustle of Tank's movements around the cabin. The once somber, silent space had begun to feel different, alive even. Tank, in his quiet way, was starting to bring something back into Marcus's life that had been missing for far too long, a sense of purpose. Marcus had always prided himself on his independence, on his ability to push through pain and hardship without asking for help. As a Marine sniper, he'd been trained to survive, to endure, and to thrive in the face of adversity, but no amount of training had prepared him for the emotional toll that came with his injuries, the weight of guilt that pressed down on him every day, and the loss of his wife. The quiet devastation he'd been living in for so long was something he couldn't fight, something that had eaten away at him piece by piece. It wasn't until Tank arrived, broken and abandoned in the storm, that Marcus realized what he had been missing. Tank's recovery, much like Marcus's, was gradual. The dog was tentative at first, unsure of Marcus's intentions, always flinching at the slightest movement. His ribs still showed through his thin coat, a testament to the abuse he'd suffered before the storm, but with each passing day, he grew stronger. Marcus kept the cabin warm, the food plentiful, and the atmosphere calm. It wasn't much, but it was all Tank needed. At first, Tank had little interest in food. He would turn his head away when Marcus offered him a bowl of water or a morsel of meat. But Marcus didn't force him. He knew that healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. He didn't want to rush Tank's recovery, just as he hadn't rushed his own. Instead, Marcus simply sat by him, letting Tank adjust to the new reality of safety and comfort. There were days when Tank would hide in the corner of the cabin, his eyes wide with fear, as if he were still waiting for something to go wrong. And there were days when he would curl up at Marcus's feet, his body trembling with exhaustion, but allowing himself to rest. Marcus had been there too. There were days when he hid from the world, and others when he'd allowed himself a small moment of peace. But every day, he saw small signs of progress in Tank. A wag of the tail, a soft nudge against his hand, a quiet whine when he walked out of the room. It was a bond, slow and steady, but undeniably growing. One morning, Marcus woke to find Tank sitting by the door, staring out the window. The sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in days, casting a soft golden light on the landscape. For a brief moment, Marcus thought he saw something different in Tank's posture, something like hope. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but Marcus recognized it. Tank was beginning to trust him. It was a small victory, but to Marcus, it meant the world. After everything he had been through, after the physical and emotional scars that marked him, he knew how important trust was. Trust had been shattered when the war had taken so much from him. Trust had been shattered when Elizabeth had died without warning. But here, with Tank, trust was being rebuilt in the quiet moments they shared. Trust wasn't something you earned overnight. It was something you had to show. Day after day, with no promises, no expectations, just presence. The routine they developed together was simple but comforting. Marcus would wake up early, roll to the kitchen, and start a pot of coffee. Tank, who had begun to follow Marcus around the cabin like a shadow, would sit by his feet, watching him intently. The dog had learned to navigate the cabin with more confidence, his once shaky legs now strong enough to carry him from room to room. When Marcus would sit down to eat, Tank would watch him with wide eyes, his stomach growling, his hunger growing more obvious with each passing day. One day, Marcus decided to give it a try. He set a small bowl of food in front of Tank and sat back, waiting. The dog sniffed it cautiously, then turned his gaze back to Marcus. For a moment, they just stared at each other. a silent understanding passing between them. And then, slowly, Tank took a tentative bite. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was a victory, not just for Tank, but for himself. The dog was trusting him enough to eat, to survive. And in return, Marcus was trusting himself enough to keep going. Their bond grew stronger each day. Marcus would take Tank on short walks through the woods, a slow and steady pace that allowed them both to feel the rhythm of the outside world. It was a strange feeling for Marcus, being out in nature again, but it was comforting in its own way. He remembered the walks he used to take with Elizabeth before everything had changed. There had been peace in those moments, in the simplicity of being together, of walking side by side, without needing words. Now, he shared those moments with Tank. The dog was becoming more curious, sniffing the air, taking in the smells of the forest as though discovering the world anew. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of companionship in those moments, quiet, unspoken, but profoundly real. In the evenings, after their walks, Marcus would sit by the fireplace, reading old books or simply watching Tank curl up by his side. The dog had begun to settle more easily now, his body relaxed, no longer tense or fearful at every movement. It was as though Tank was learning to trust again, just as Marcus was. The transformation in both of them was subtle, but undeniable. Marcus could feel the weight of his past beginning to lift. Just a little. He wasn't healed, not by a long shot, but the act of caring for Tank, of having someone, something to take care of, was slowly bringing him back from the brink. It was the small moments, the quiet triumphs, the tiny signs of progress that kept him going. Tank wasn't just a dog to Marcus. He wasn't just a pet or a companion. He was a mirror of Marcus's own journey, a broken soul, struggling to heal, to trust again. And in helping Tank heal, Marcus found himself healing too. One step at a time, one day at a time. They were both learning to live again. The days bled into each other as Marcus and Tank settled into a quiet rhythm. The seasons were slowly changing, the air growing crisper, the leaves beginning their annual transformation. It was autumn in the woods near Flagstaff, and there was something about the way the leaves danced in the wind that seemed to mirror the slow, painful progress of healing. Both Marcus and Tank were changing, day by day, step by step, though it was so gradual that at times neither of them could recognize it. Marcus had stopped counting the days since he had found Tank in the storm. Time had started to lose its significance. Each day felt like a small victory, each moment spent together a lesson in patience and trust. Tank, once a trembling shell of a dog, was starting to show signs of recovery. He ate with more enthusiasm now, his ribs no longer as pronounced as they once were. His coat, though still dull, had started to regain some of its shine. But it wasn't just the physical healing that Marcus noticed. It was the subtle changes in Tank's behavior, the way the dog had started to open up to him. Tank had begun following Marcus around the cabin without hesitation, no longer flinching at his every movement. It wasn't just the food and shelter that had changed the dog. It was the steady, constant presence of Marcus, who, despite his own emotional wounds, was offering Tank something the dog had likely never known: stability and care. Marcus had no illusions about the depth of Tank's trauma. He saw it in the dog's haunted eyes, in the way Tank would sometimes startle at loud noises or hide under the couch when Marcus moved too quickly. But those moments were becoming less frequent. Tank was learning to trust again, and so, in some strange way, was Marcus. It was one particular morning, just after sunrise, when Marcus realized how far they had come. He had wheeled his chair out to the porch, the crisp autumn air biting at his skin, and sat down to watch the sun rise over the trees. Tank, as he often did now, lay by his feet, his body curled into a relaxed, almost content position. For the first time in weeks, Marcus didn't feel like an intruder in his own life. He didn't feel consumed by the weight of his past or trapped in the endless loop of his memories. Instead, he felt present. Tank lifted his head from Marcus's lap and sniffed the air, his ears perking up. The dog stood slowly, moving toward the edge of the porch. Marcus followed his gaze and saw a family of deer grazing quietly in the meadow beyond the trees. It was a peaceful sight, and for a moment Marcus forgot about the pain and the memories that had burdened him for so long. Tank, however, did not forget. His body stiffened, his muscles tensing as though he was preparing for something. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what Tank was reacting to. Perhaps it was the fear of being abandoned again, the fear that something good would be taken away from him. It was a reaction Marcus understood all too well. But just as Marcus was about to reach out to calm the dog, something changed. Tank let out a low growl, but it was not the frightened, panicked growl that Marcus had heard in the past. This one was different. It was protective, resolute. Marcus smiled softly, his hand resting on Tank's back. The dog had begun to find his voice, not out of fear or desperation, but out of a desire to protect, to assert himself. It was as though Tank had come to understand that he wasn't alone anymore. He was safe. And he was worthy of safety. It was a simple thing, but it spoke volumes about how far Tank had come. For the rest of the day, Tank followed Marcus through the cabin, never far behind, his eyes now following Marcus's every movement without hesitation. When Marcus sat down to read, Tank would curl up at his feet, occasionally nudging his hand for attention, as if reminding him that they were in this together. The quiet moments between them were becoming more frequent, and Marcus felt the distance he had once put between himself and the world begin to shrink. It wasn't just the dog's healing that had started to change Marcus. It was the small, almost imperceptible shifts within him. His nightmares, which had once come every night without fail, began to visit less frequently. The flashbacks that had once haunted his days, visions of war, the screams of comrades, the feeling of helplessness, faded into the background, pushed out by the steady, comforting presence of Tank. Marcus knew that the pain would never fully disappear, but he had begun to understand something vital, that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey. One evening, as the light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, Marcus sat on the porch with Tank at his side, watching the world go by. There was a quietness to it, a peace that had eluded him for so long. He thought about the man he had been, the Marine who had once been full of pride and certainty. And he realized how far he had fallen from that version of himself. But he also realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe it was okay to be broken, to be uncertain, to be human. Maybe, just maybe, healing didn't mean returning to who he was before. It meant becoming something new. Tank, for all his scars, for all his brokenness, had already become something new. He wasn't just a dog who had been saved. He was a symbol of recovery, of resilience. And Marcus, in the quiet companionship of his days with Tank, was beginning to see that he, too, could become something new. He could still find purpose, still find a way to live beyond the things that had hurt him. As Tank rested his head on Marcus's lap, his breathing steady and content, Marcus thought about the future. He didn't know what it held, or where his journey would take him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope, and he wasn't alone anymore. Tank had given him that in his own silent, steadfast way. The dog had begun to heal, and in turn, Marcus had begun to heal too. Together, they had come a long way. And while the road ahead was uncertain, it was a road they would walk together. And for that, Marcus was grateful. It was a crisp autumn morning when Marcus Cole realized that his life had shifted in ways he hadn't fully understood until that very moment. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of purpose, something beyond the day-to-day survival of his own existence. He wasn't just living anymore, he was doing something. He was a man with a reason to get out of bed, a reason to be more than just a shadow of the person he had once been. It was all thanks to Tank. The German Shepherd had gone from a broken, abandoned animal to a reliable and loyal companion, a dog whose silent strength mirrored Marcus's own struggles. It was remarkable how Tank's healing process seemed to mirror Marcus's emotional recovery. As Tank became more and more confident in himself, Marcus too found himself regaining the confidence he had lost years ago. The dog, who had once cowered in fear, now followed Marcus with a kind of pride and purpose. But the true test of Tank's transformation came one afternoon when Marcus was doing something that had become part of his daily routine: fixing the mailbox at the edge of his property. The mailbox, a small but significant task that reminded Marcus of the life he used to lead, was something he had always taken care of. Today, the task had been a simple one: just tightening a few screws and replacing a weathered post. However, as Marcus bent down to make the final adjustment, disaster struck. His wheelchair, a device that had been his lifeline since the explosion in Afghanistan, slipped on the damp earth, sending him toppling forward. His hands shot out in a desperate attempt to catch himself, but the weight of his body and the awkward angle of his fall made it impossible. In an instant, he was on the ground, face down, his wheelchair tipped over and out of reach. Panic surged through him as he realized just how vulnerable he was, alone, unable to move, and with no one nearby to help. The once military-trained Marine who had navigated war zones, who had survived the unimaginable, now felt utterly powerless, trapped by his own body. He lay there for several moments, breathing heavily, staring at the wet dirt beneath him, unable to summon the strength to get back up. The only sounds were the distant rustling of trees and the occasional snap of a twig. And then he heard it. A low bark, followed by the frantic sound of claws skittering across the ground. It was Tank. The dog had been lounging under a nearby tree. But now, at the sound of Marcus's fall, Tank's protective instincts kicked in. Marcus heard the dog barking urgently, his tail thumping against the ground as he darted around Marcus, unsure of how to help but determined to do something. Marcus could barely move, his legs pinned beneath him and his arms too weak to push himself up. But Tank wasn't about to leave him there. Without hesitation, the dog darted to the porch, barking louder now, and then bolted toward the neighbor's cabin, several hundred yards away. It was a desperate, frantic run, fueled by the same protective instinct that had started to take root in Tank ever since Marcus had taken him in. It wasn't long before Marcus heard the sound of tires crunching over the gravel driveway. Tank had run to the neighbor's house, where an elderly woman named Carol lived. Carol had always been kind to Marcus, though he had never made much of an effort to speak with her. Now, Tank had done the one thing that Marcus had been too proud to do himself: reach out to someone else for help. Within moments, Carol arrived, breathless but determined, with Tank trailing at her heels. Looking over his shoulder, as though making sure Marcus was still there, Carol rushed over to help Marcus up, supporting him as she gently lifted him back into his chair. She checked him over for any injuries, but aside from some bruises and scrapes, he was largely unharmed. Still, Marcus could feel the tremors of anxiety running through him, his heart racing from the shock of the fall. "That dog of yours sure knows how to get attention," Carol remarked with a laugh, wiping her brow. "I've never seen him run so fast. He was barking and running in circles, trying to get someone to notice." Tank, now panting and standing proudly by Marcus's side, seemed to hold his head a little higher. It was as though the dog knew that he had done something important, something meaningful. The small hero had come through in a way that no one expected. Marcus looked down at Tank, his heart swelling with gratitude. The dog hadn't just alerted Carol. He had saved him in a way that no one else could have. Tank had acted without thinking, instinctively protecting his human from harm, just as Marcus had once been trained to do for his comrades in the military. But now, Tank wasn't just a companion to Marcus. He was something more. He was his savior. And for that, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of awe. Over the next few days, the story of Tank's heroic actions spread. It was shared by the local news, and soon people from all over the area were reaching out to Marcus. Calls came in from veterans' groups, animal shelters, and local organizations, all expressing their admiration for Tank's bravery. A few even suggested that Tank be awarded for his actions, something that both amused and humbled Marcus. But It wasn't the accolades or attention that mattered most to Marcus. What mattered was the undeniable shift in the relationship between him and Tank. The dog had always been a source of comfort, a reminder that life could still hold moments of connection and hope. But now, Tank had proven that he was more than just a companion. He was a hero in his own right, a symbol of survival, loyalty, and the power of unconditional love. As the days passed, Marcus began to reflect on the significance of what had happened. He had been helpless, unable to move, and in that moment, Tank had shown him that even the most broken souls could rise to the occasion. The dog had rescued him not just from a physical fall, but from the emotional and psychological isolation he had lived in for so long. Tank had become a living testament to the idea that, even in the darkest times, there could still be light. It wasn't just Tank's bravery that had changed everything. It was the way Marcus had learned to rely on others again, to accept help, to allow himself to be vulnerable. For the first time in years, Marcus wasn't just surviving, he was living, truly living, because of the connection he shared with Tank, a bond that had become deeper and more meaningful with every passing day. As the sun set on that autumn evening, Marcus sat outside on the porch, Tank by his side. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace. And in the quiet, with the cool evening breeze stirring the air, Marcus realized something profound. Tank had not only saved his life, but he had given it back to him. After the incident with the mailbox, when Tank had so courageously sought help and brought Carol to Marcus's aid, things began to shift in ways that Marcus hadn't anticipated. The small town outside Flagstaff, where Marcus lived in his isolated cabin, was never one for much excitement. But suddenly, the local news had caught on to the story of the heroic German shepherd. Marcus was stunned by how much attention Tank's actions had garnered. It had started as a local interest piece, but soon Marcus's inbox was flooded with messages from veterans, animal lovers, and various organizations that supported PTSD survivors. People from all walks of life were reaching out, sharing stories of their own struggles, of their own battles with inner demons. They spoke of their dogs, their companions, who had helped them navigate the darkness in ways that words couldn't explain. Tank, who had been astray, a wounded creature left to the mercy of the storm, was now a symbol of healing, of hope, and of second chances. But it wasn't just about Tank anymore. The more Marcus read through the messages, the more he realized that his story, and Tank's, had the potential to inspire others. It wasn't just about rescuing a dog or a man. It was about creating a bridge, a connection between people who needed help and the animals who could provide it. And so, a seed was planted in Marcus's mind. He'd never been one for public endeavors, never sought out attention or admiration. But after reading the letters, the outpouring of support, and the shared pain from so many people who had been left broken by the world, Marcus knew that something needed to be done, something bigger than just him, something that could turn the pain of isolation into a collective journey of healing. A few days later, he sat down and drafted a proposal. He named it Tank's Unit. The idea was simple, a program that would pair veterans and others suffering from PTSD with abandoned dogs in need of homes. The concept was inspired by his own relationship with Tank, their shared journey of healing and mutual dependence. It wasn't just about rescuing the dogs, it was about creating partnerships, finding a way to heal together. The program would be based on the idea that both the veterans and the dogs had been broken, but together they could piece each other back together. Marcus envisioned a network of shelters, trainers, and volunteers who would help train the dogs, making them ready to be paired with people who could benefit from their companionship. The goal wasn't just to adopt dogs. It was to foster an environment where people who had been to the darkest places could find light through the animals who had been abandoned in their own right. As Marcus finalized the details of the program, he realized just how much work was ahead of him. Tank, the dog who had saved him, was now part of something much larger. He wasn't just a companion anymore. He was the heart of the mission, the living embodiment of everything the program stood for. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Marcus reached out to local shelters, began networking with veterans organizations, and built a website for Tank's unit. It wasn't easy. Marcus wasn't a businessman, nor was he someone who had ever been particularly adept at managing anything outside of his own life. But the messages kept coming. Messages from veterans, messages from families who had lost their loved ones to the wars, from people struggling with the same invisible wounds Marcus had carried for so long. The first dog to be officially paired through Tank's unit was a nervous and wary Rottweiler named Diesel. He had been abandoned by his previous owner and had spent months in a local shelter, refusing to trust anyone. Diesel had spent his days curled up in a corner, afraid to come out, much like Tank had been when Marcus first found him. Diesel was paired with a veteran named Jason, who had returned from 2 tours in Iraq. Jason had struggled with severe PTSD, feeling as though he were constantly on high alert. He'd tried therapy, medication, and even support groups, but nothing had worked. He was still haunted by the memories of war, the loss of comrades, and the isolation he felt from the world. When Jason and Diesel met for the first time, neither one knew what to expect. Diesel was hesitant, still afraid of the world around him, while Jason was guarded, unsure of how a dog could help him. But as the days passed, something changed. Diesel began to trust Jason, slowly but surely. The dog would follow him everywhere, just as Tank had done for Marcus. Jason found himself opening up to Diesel in ways he hadn't opened up to anyone else. Marcus had been there for the first meeting, and when he saw the two of them, Jason, standing tall and strong, and Diesel, the once broken dog, now standing beside him, he knew that Tank's unit had the potential to change lives. This was no longer just a program. It was a lifeline for those who had been overlooked, ignored, or forgotten. As Tank's unit began to grow, so did the stories. Jason and Diesel were soon joined by others, a Navy veteran named Sarah and a golden retriever named Lucy, an Air Force vet named Mark, and a shepherd mix named Bella. Each pairing brought a new chapter in their healing journeys, and each story felt like a victory. One small, quiet moment of redemption. Marcus was amazed by the ripple effect that Tank's unit had created. It was no longer just a program. It was a community, a network of people and dogs who were learning to heal together. The stories were shared on social media, in local newspapers, and eventually even on national news. Tank, the dog who had been abandoned and broken, had become the face of something that was giving people hope again. As Tank's unit gained momentum, Marcus's own transformation continued. He wasn't just a man recovering from the scars of war anymore. He had become a leader, someone who had created something meaningful out of his own pain. The once isolated man who had hidden from the world was now stepping into the light, not as a soldier, but as a symbol of resilience, a man who had found his purpose through a dog. And it was all thanks to Tank, the dog who had not only saved Marcus's life, but had changed the lives of so many others. Tank had become a living testament to the power of second chances. And Marcus had learned, through his bond with the dog, that sometimes it was only through healing together that you could truly begin to heal yourself. The success of Tank's unit had spread far beyond Marcus's small corner of Flagstaff. What had started as a simple idea, born from the quiet companionship between a man and his dog, had blossomed into a movement that reached across the country. Tank, the German shepherd, who had once been nothing more than an abandoned, trembling animal in a storm, had transformed into a symbol of healing, of hope, resilience, and the power of second chances. The organization, now fully established, had helped pair over 100 dogs with veterans and individuals struggling with PTSD. Each success story built upon the last, creating a ripple effect of healing that spread through communities and touched lives in ways Marcus had never imagined. But despite the growing recognition and accolades, Marcus had always remained focused on the core of what Tank's unit represented, the unbreakable bond between humans and dogs, and the profound healing that occurred when both shared their pain and strength. Tank himself had become something of a local celebrity. His image was often featured in newspapers, on local television stations, and across social media platforms. But as much as the attention flattered Marcus, he never lost sight of the purpose behind it all. Tank wasn't just a hero because of the dramatic moment in the rain, or because of the countless lives he had helped change. Tank had become a symbol of something much larger, a beacon for all those who had felt abandoned, forgotten, or broken by life's challenges. It was during one of the many therapy visits that Tank's role as a true healer was most evident. Marcus and Tank had been invited to a local rehabilitation center for veterans, where they were to spend the day with those still struggling to adjust to civilian life. The center was a place of refuge, a place where veterans could share their experiences, seek therapy, and find camaraderie among others who understood their struggles. But despite the supportive environment, there was always a sense of isolation among many of the veterans, some of whom had been too consumed by their own inner battles to engage with others. When Marcus and Tank arrived, they were greeted with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Some of the veterans seemed eager to meet the dog, while others remained aloof, unsure of how a dog could possibly help with the weight they carried. Marcus had seen this kind of reluctance before, but he was patient. He knew that healing couldn't be forced, and it had to be a quiet, natural process, one that unfolded on its own time. Tank, however, wasted no time in making an impact. As they entered the common room, Tank walked with his usual calm, steady pace. His fur, once matted and worn from the years of abuse, now gleamed with health, and his posture exuded the quiet confidence that only a dog who had been through the fire could possess. Tank's eyes scanned the room, and without hesitation, he trotted up to a veteran sitting by the window, his gaze distant and lost in thought. The veteran, a man named James, looked up as Tank approached. For a moment he didn't react. He simply stared at the dog, as if unsure of what to make of the animal's presence. Tank, sensing the hesitation, sat down a few feet away, his tail gently thumping against the floor. There was no rush, no demand for affection, just a quiet, steady presence. James blinked, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to cautiously pat Tank's head. The touch was tentative at first, almost hesitant. But as Tank leaned into the hand, something in James seemed to shift. The veteran's eyes softened, his body visibly relaxing as he continued to stroke the dog's fur. It wasn't an immediate transformation. There was no sudden burst of emotion, no dramatic revelation. But in that simple, shared moment of connection, James began to open up, bit by bit. "I used to have a dog like him," James muttered, his voice low and filled with sorrow. Before I left for deployment, she was always there. Always made me feel like I wasn't alone." Marcus watched quietly, giving James the space to share his memories. Tank, meanwhile, continued to rest beside him, offering comfort in the only way he knew how, by simply being there. Over the course of the afternoon, Tank moved through the room, gently approaching other veterans who seemed too caught in their own battles to interact. With each veteran he visited, the same transformation unfolded: a softening of the eyes, a deepening of breath, and a slight shift in posture. Some veterans spoke to Tank about their own pets from the past, while others sat quietly, letting the dog's steady presence soothe them in ways words could not. Tank's calming energy had a remarkable effect on everyone he encountered. As the day came to a close, Marcus felt a quiet pride well up within him. He had seen this happen before, Tank's silent, unspoken healing power, but it still amazed him each time. The dog who had once been lost in a storm, broken and abandoned, had become a force for good. He had helped veterans open up, had given them something to hold on to in their darkest moments. Tank had become more than just a dog. He was a living symbol of healing, a reminder that no matter how far someone had fallen, there was always a way back. After their visit to the rehabilitation center, Marcus and Tank returned to the cabin, as they always did. The storm clouds of the past still loomed over Marcus's memories, but they no longer had the same power over him. Tank had reminded him that healing didn't happen in isolation. It happened when people were willing to reach out, to connect, and to be vulnerable with one another. Tank, lying at Marcus's feet as the night descended, had become a symbol not just for those who suffered from PTSD, but for anyone who had faced loss, abandonment, or pain. He was proof that even in the darkest times, there was hope. He was a symbol of resilience, of the power of love, and the profound connection that could be forged between a human and an animal. As Marcus sat on the porch that evening, Tank by his side, he reflected on the journey they had both been on. He thought about the countless lives Tank had touched, the hearts that had been healed by his presence, and the profound difference the dog had made, not just in his own life, but in the lives of so many others. Maybe Tank had been the one to save him after all, Marcus thought. He had come into Marcus's life when he had been at his lowest, and together they had learned to heal. And now, through Tank's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty, they were helping others do the same. With the stars overhead and Tank resting by his side, Marcus realized that sometimes it was the smallest moments, the quietest, simplest acts of love that could change the world, and Tank, in his own humble way, had done just that. The sun was setting over the vast Arizona landscape, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. The once harsh desert had softened in the fading light, the rolling hills and distant mountains now a peaceful silhouette against the sky. Marcus Cole sat on the porch of his small cabin, Tank curled up beside him, his head resting on Marcus's knee. The gentle breeze carried the scent of the earth, of pine and sagebrush, and the world felt quiet, at peace in a way it hadn't for so long. It had been a long road since that first stormy night when Marcus had found Tank, a broken, abandoned dog left to suffer alone in the wilderness. That day had been the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, one filled with healing, growth, and most importantly, a sense of purpose. And now, as they sat together in the calm of the evening, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Tank had not only saved him that night, they had saved each other, in a way. In the years since, Tank had become not just a companion, but a symbol of healing for so many others. The dog, who had once been a symbol of abandonment and pain, had now become a living testament to the resilience of both animals and humans. Tank's journey from brokenness to healing mirrored Marcus's own path, a path that had been full of darkness and loss, but was now bathed in the light of hope. Maybe it took losing everything, Marcus muttered softly to himself, his voice barely audible over the evening wind. Tank's eyes flickered open, and he looked up at Marcus, his expression calm and trusting. Maybe it took losing everything to realize how much love I still had to give. Marcus had often struggled with the idea of what it meant to be whole again. He had been a Marine sniper, a man defined by his physical strength and mental fortitude. But the explosion that had taken his legs had shattered not just his body, but his sense of self. When Elizabeth died suddenly from a stroke, the last bit of him that still held on to the world was gone, and Marcus had retreated into himself, into his isolation, unwilling to let anyone see the broken man he had become. But Tank had changed all that. Tank had shown him that healing wasn't about returning to who he had been. It was about becoming who he could still be. And in giving Tank the chance to heal, Marcus had begun to heal too. The dog had taught him that strength didn't come from physical ability alone. It came from the will to keep going, from the courage to face the darkness and still choose to move forward. Looking down at Tank, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude. The dog had been the catalyst for everything that had changed in his life. Without Tank, without that night in the storm, he would still be a man lost in the shadows of his past. Tank had given him a reason to live again, to reach out, to connect with others. And through Tank, Marcus had found a new sense of purpose, a new mission, to help other veterans and people suffering from PTSD find the same healing that he and Tank had found together. "You've come a long way, haven't you, boy?" Marcus whispered, his hand resting gently on Tank's head. Tank lifted his eyes to meet Marcus's, and for a brief moment the two of them simply shared an understanding. It was as if the dog could sense the weight of the words, the depth of what they had accomplished together. Tank, once a broken and abandoned animal, had become a symbol of hope for countless people who had been lost in the aftermath of war, loss, and pain. Through Marcus's program, Tank's unit, veterans and others struggling with PTSD had found healing not just through the therapy of their animals, but through the relationships they built. Together, they had found a way to navigate the darkness of their past and build something beautiful from it. But what Marcus had come to understand, perhaps more than anything else, was that healing wasn't just about being fixed. It was about embracing the broken parts of ourselves and learning to move forward in spite of them. Marcus wasn't the same man he had been before the war, before the accident, before Elizabeth's death. But in that imperfection, in that brokenness, he had found something he hadn't known he had been missing: love, compassion, and the strength to keep going. As the evening light faded into twilight, Marcus sat quietly, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. Tank was still by his side, content, at peace. The world seemed to be holding its breath, the silence between them comfortable, filled with everything they had shared, every moment of struggle, every small victory. It was a silence that spoke volumes, one that said they had both come through something unthinkable, and now they were whole in a way that mattered. Marcus closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath of the cool night air. He could feel the weight of the day lifting, the pressure of the past finally easing. The future was still uncertain, still filled with unknowns, but for the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel afraid. The path ahead would be filled with its own challenges, but he knew now that he was not alone. In the quiet of the night, Marcus realized that he had been wrong to believe that healing was a linear path. It wasn't something you could measure or predict. It came in waves, in moments of connection, in acts of compassion. And sometimes it took losing everything to realize just how much love you still had to give, to yourself, to others, and to the world. Tank's soft breathing beside him was a reminder of that truth. In the presence of his loyal companion, Marcus understood the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, we don't just save a life. They save us right back. With that thought in his heart, Marcus stood, taking one last look at the sunset before he and Tank walked back into the cabin. The journey wasn't over, but as they stepped into the warmth of the house together, Marcus knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt at home.